The Liberals actually promised to increase our already huge debt. Over the next 4 years, they promise to spend $85 billion more than they'll earn. Now, if you think that's terrible, bad news. Labor actually promises to spend and borrow even more than that. Now, no one seems to have the guts to say we can't afford this, that our spending is out of control and that voters simply want too much. Actually, that's not quite right. One political party is saying all that. It's the Liberal Democrats, and its leader and only Senator, David Leyonhjelm, joins me now. Good to see you, David.
Hello, Andrew.
Now, David, how much danger are we in when the two big parties are arguing only about whether to put up another $85 billion on the credit card or even more?
Oh, it's really quite serious. We've got $40 billion deficit now, 286, I think it is, billion net debt, and it's costing us $1 billion a month in interest, and the only reason it's $1 billion is because interest rates are so low. If we lose our AAA credit rating, and that's a distinct possibility, interest rates will go up. If there's a world downturn and our trade, terms of trade go south, we'll be in all sorts of trouble. We've just got absolutely no flexibility to deal with a recession, a crisis, an economic downturn of any description. And the tragedy of it is, as you said, neither side of politics seems to be doing anything about it. And yet, I think they both know exactly what should be done. You just don't have the courage to take the Australian public into their confidence.
No, that's exactly what makes it so disgraceful and so dispiriting, David. And listen, in case anyone's wondering whether I've just interrupted you in another boozing session at your local, you're there at the pub because Paul Murray is going to have you on his show, so it's not that you're a big boozer. But anyway, I just wonder, David, how did we get to this point? You know, is it because politicians are stupid and venal and vote hungry? Or is it, on the other hand, that somehow they've got a public too greedy to hear the truth?
Well, it started with the global financial crisis and the feeling that we had to spend money in order to get ourselves out of the crisis, and the Labor Party argues that they saved Australia from a terrible fate by doing that. There is actually some of the fault goes back to the John Howard and Peter Costello era, with things like family tax benefit and school kids bonus and things like that, middle class welfare. Instead of giving us tax cuts, yes, exactly. Instead of giving us tax cuts, they started handing out money to people who weren't poor. It was a vote-buying exercise, and of course both sides of politics are quite happy to buy our votes with our own money. They don't seem to be able to persuade the Australian public that this is a bad idea. They both know what needs to be done, they just don't know how to do it and win votes. That's what it amounts to.
Yeah, and I have to say, for me, and I said it to him only yesterday, the best speech, most important speech delivered in Australia in the last decade was Joe Hockey's Age of Entitlement, the end of the Age of Entitlement speech. What a shame nothing's come of that. But what would you do to cut spending?
Well, I think in political terms, we've got a whole raft of things where we would stop funding. You know, we would be fairly drastic about what doesn't need to be funded. But in political terms, I think there's some low-hanging fruit, if you like. Middle-class welfare is the obvious place to start. There are people on $180,000 a year receiving family tax benefits. There is no cap at all, no income cap at all on childcare benefits. There are people in multi-million-dollar houses receiving the age pension, being paid for by people who don't even own a house, who earn relatively moderate incomes. So there's quite a lot of middle-class welfare like that. If you also talk about help loans for students, not all students are broke. Not all students are really poor and need a very concessional loan. So there is quite a lot of middle-class welfare. Welfare should be for poor people. Then if you add to that the fact that there's a duplication between the states and the Commonwealth, health, education and environment, for example, both big Commonwealth departments, but also every state has those departments too. Why do we have to double up like that? I think there's tremendous scope for cutting back on spending.
What about one thing that, and I know all these things, it's almost like you're writing a suicide note on television right now, David. Don't vote for me because I'll withdraw your goodies. But just to really put a cap on it for you, what about one of my bugbears where we are paying the age pension, which is a huge percentage of our budget, to people who are sitting in homes worth $2, $3, $4 million without asking them to, well, listen, once you die or if you sell or something, we'd like the pension we gave you to be repaid to us out of the proceeds.
Yes, I agree with you on that one. The other thing we're doing is taxing their superannuation so they have less incentive to save for their retirement as well. So, you know, we're compounding the problem. We should be able to say to people, look, you know, you own a wealthy property, you have the means to liquidate some of that, either by a reverse mortgage or sell it and scale down, whatever it takes, and liquidate some of that equity in your property and live on it so that you don't require other people's money to live on it. But we're too, I mean, both sides of politics are too frightened to take on the reaction that would result. And a lot of that reaction is driven by people who would like to inherit that house. So they're quite happy to see mum and dad on the pension, and they will inherit the house when they pass on.
But really, David, I mean, you know that when you're standing there or sitting there on national TV saying things like, cut this, do that, there's an uproar, all that kind of stuff, the blowback, you know it's making it harder for you to get re-elected, just as it makes it harder for any politician. It's like we've passed the point of no return where there are too many more people with their hands out than there are having to pay for it all.
Yeah, you're quite right. There are way too many people who with their hands out. It's fairly understandable, though. You can see your neighbour, your friends, your family with their hands out. It's working. They're getting money from the government. They think, well, why should I be any different? They put their hands out. We do need to change the culture. We do need to get to the point where people think if I'm receiving money from the government, that's because I'm poor and it's nothing to be proud of and it's nothing to aim for. I think we can change the culture. We have to start somewhere, though, and I think the middle class welfare is a good place to start. If we start convincing people, look, why should people on $300,000 a year or $1 million a year have childcare subsidies, for example? Completely unnecessary. Why should people on $180,000 a year receive family tax benefits? Completely unnecessary. If we start at those sort of levels, I think we can win the argument. But someone's got to start. No one's even trying at the moment.
Yeah, well, to me it's sad there's only one Liberal Democrat in Parliament to argue this case. It's weird. But listen, without pumping up your tyres too much, because these are issues I care about as well, you're also fighting for more freedoms. Which one in particular?
Well, probably the nanny state and political correctness are the two that animate me the most. And political correctness is sort of free speech plus. So free speech is fundamental to a free society. Without free speech, you don't have many of your other freedoms. So free speech, political correctness and the nanny state really animate me a lot. Telling people how to live their lives, you know, when they're really not that qualified to live their own lives, let alone live anybody else's, is extremely arrogant. And one of the issues that needs to be considered is the nanny state is profoundly anti-democratic. You know, if you're too stupid to know to wear a bicycle helmet, for example, or to make a conscious choice about wearing a bicycle helmet, how could you possibly trusted to vote correctly? You know, you're too stupid to know what's good for yourself, therefore how can you vote for what's good for yourself? It has very anti-democratic underpinnings, that whole line of thinking that the elite have.
Sounds like you're proposing a Darwinian solution. If you're too stupid to put in a helmet and you leave the gene pool, maybe I shouldn't go there. One other freedom, though, that I have some worries about, I don't know, David, guns. You're also against our gun laws. You say they're too tough. Why is that?
Well, they focus on the gun more to the point, and they also have this sort of collective responsibility and collective guilt. So they assume that certain guns are more likely to be misused than others, and there's really no evidence for that. They assume also that gun owners are potential criminals in waiting, and there's really little evidence for that. If you keep guns out of the hands who have violent tendencies, and that's whether domestic or criminal or whatever, or make threats of violence, you basically get rid of those who are likely to cause harm. And that's the exact opposite of the situation here. We're highly regulated in terms of who can get a gun, and we're highly regulated in terms of what kind of guns we can have. The end result is all of us shooters and target shooters as the only target shooters and hunters are the only kinds of shooters who there are in Australia, pretty much. You know, we're persecuted, we're harassed by the police, and you know, it's not legitimate.
But David, you last year said John Howard's laws in 1996, after the massacre down in Tasmania, Port Arthur, he banned some kinds of semi-automatics, brought back more than 600,000 guns out of the hands of the public. You said that made no difference to firearms violence and gun violence overall. Well, a new paper published just now in the Journal of American Medical Association said that's wrong. In the 17 years before 1996, 13 fatal mass shootings, which means 5 or more victims, and in the 20 years since, none. 13 before, none since. Doesn't that show you're wrong?
No, well, that paper was written by 2 of the leading anti-gun lobbyists. There was no new data in that. There's alternative papers which analyse that and dispute it. In fact, that paper conceded that the data did not show that the gun laws had reduced the level of gun violence. All they argued was that there were no mass murders. Now, even that is wrong. They set out to argue that from the point of view of saying 5 victims equals a mass murder. Now, the FBI, America's FBI, Australia's Institute of Criminology, both say 4 is a mass murder. Now, if you apply that standard, we've had several mass murders since 1996. I've got a little list here, actually. The Hunt family in 2014 was a murder-suicide. That actually had 5 victims. We've had half a dozen where there were 3 victims. We had one in Roxburgh Park in Victoria with 4 victims. In 2002, there was a shooting involving Vietnamese in Cabramatta where there were 7 victims. Now, nobody died, but if they'd all died, it would have been 7 victims. So to argue that the gun laws have stopped massacres, it just doesn't stack up. The data says otherwise.
David Leyonhjelm, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure, thank you.
Coming up after the break, Culture Wars with Rowan Dean.